Want to give a quick shout out to all of my patrons. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. And I am done. Okay, so I just finished up reading Empire of Silence by Christopher Ruocchio. This is the first book in the Sun Eater, I don't know how many books there are, but the Sun Eater series. And I want to give you my unedited thoughts upon finishing this book, which was just right now. This book is incredible. This is so good. It's an easy 5 out of 5. It's closer to like a 6 out of 5. This is, I feel like I keep saying this on this channel, but this is one of the best books that I've ever read in my life. And it's, I don't feel like I'm going overboard when I say that this is the best science fiction book that I've ever read. Now, I'm not going to sit here and claim that I've read all of the science fiction books there are, or even a good portion of them. I'm not very well, involved in science fiction, but I have read a decent amount. I feel like in my life, I've probably read, I don't know, 50, 60, which isn't a lot, but this has got to be the best one. I'm so impressed by what I just read by this incredible, incredible author. And what blows my mind, among other things, is that as I've been reading through this and I've been talking to people in my Discord, and if you haven't joined, hit the link down below. I'd love to talk to you about this book or any other book. But everybody says that's read this series that the first book is the worst one of the bunch. That's pretty crazy to me. When it's not just like a person or two or three or four, but literally every single person that's talked to me about this series has said the same exact thing. And I don't understand how that's possible. This book did everything right. And I'm not, like I mentioned earlier that, I haven't read a lot of sci-fi. I also don't really like a lot of sci-fi. It's just not for me. I like my stories to be more epic. I don't need to be wowed by the technology. That sort of thing just doesn't appeal to me. I'm looking for story. And while I admit that there are some very well done stories in the sci-fi genre, for me, this is a personal thing, Matt speaking here, I find that in general, that the very good sci-fi books compared to the very good fantasy books, will emphasize more on the world building and on the cool factor, and really the science part of the sci-fi. Where fantasy really does a really good job in general on plot. And this book kind of turned that upside down. I didn't get the science. I got some very cool stuff that I read, but I feel like what I read was an incredibly epic fantasy that just happens to be set in a space world where, it's not like in space, but there's space travel and we're hopping planets. So, there's no question that this is sci-fi, but this is epic fantasy, and there must be another term for it. Maybe there is somewhere, but that's what this is. And so let me try to go through some of the main points about this book. I don't want to ruin anything for you, but I'll say, very broadly speaking, because it's all ruined for you in the first chapter. And by ruined, I use that term very loosely, but I say that because there's a framing narrative here. And if you're not familiar with that term, think of a character that is in the present, not our present, but the present for this story, who's then relating the story either in written form or in storytelling form to somebody else, talking about their past. I think the most famous example of this is The Name of the Wind in the King Chrysler Chronicle. That is what this is. And that's certainly not the first book that has done that. And it's most certainly not the last, because here we have The Sun Eater that's going down this path as well. And it can work really well and it can work very poorly. It's a very kind of ballsy decision when an author does this, because you're telling the audience that here's how the book ends, or here's close to how it ends. Now let's get to that point. And this one ruined more than others, I found. I mean, it told you exactly how this series is going to end. And that's fine. And I don't know that it made the story better, but it certainly didn't make it worse, because I didn't care. And it didn't just do it once. It did this thing where you're constantly, whenever a new character is involved in the story, and this character plays an important role going forward, the MC in this story will say, kind of break the fourth wall, be editorializing on the side, because in this, it's written form. He's writing this story out. And he'll say, you know, I'm making this up, so I'm not ruining anything here, but, you know, and this was the moment that I realized, looking back, that this person would be my best friend for all of all time. Again, that didn't happen, but that's what he does in this constantly. And you're like, oh, I guess there's no suspense there, but there is. So very cool. Love that the storytelling device was used and didn't harm the story in any discernible way. The writing quality here I have to talk about because it is magical. It's up there with the greats of fantasy in terms of the prose. It is magical. It doesn't get a lot better than this. And I hate to keep going down this Rothfuss line because it's just on my mind. But I think when everybody thinks of popular fantasy stories, and I'm going to keep talking about fantasy here because this book really felt like a fantasy book. But people think of Rothfuss as the great, you know, and there's others that are up there, but nobody can be better than him. There's no difference here. You know, different in that they use prose differently, but one of them is not better than the other. I'm confident in saying that. And what's shocking to me is when this book was written, you know, Christopher Ruocchio is younger than me. I think he's a decent amount younger than me. And when he wrote this book, if I'm doing my timelines right, he was in his mid-20s. I don't understand how that's possible. I don't understand that because it should have taken this guy decades, not years, decades to get to the level that he's at. And it just reminds me that in all things, there are prodigies that thank God that they ended up in the field that they ended up in so that the world gets to witness their greatness. You know, I was talking about it in the Discord channel to somebody, but it kind of reminds me of, you know, some basketball player that comes in out of college that's instantly the greatest. And that's not the way it's supposed to happen. You're supposed to work up to that point. You know, you're supposed to take a few years, you know, a few duds, or at least, you know, growing into it. That just didn't happen here. I mean, this guy is a great in writing. And I hope that he only gets better. I can't wait to follow this guy's career because he is something special. I mean, I hope that he kind of goes forward and doesn't burn out and kind of keeps churning out some books because he'll go down as one of the greatest writers of all time, in my opinion. If he doesn't kind of just lay an egg here and he just keeps marching forward. And I can't wait to be around and read it. And I'll read everything this guy writes. I can't wait to read the next one. The story here is amazing. It's not the grandest scope that you're ever going to read. I trust that it will get there because all of the groundwork is being laid here. But the story is deeply compelling. It's a story that is in some core parts. It felt like there are some authors that might have said, you know, book one done, you know, book two within the same book. You know, Erickson does that in Malazan because they're very different. You know, he'll, you know, be on one planet, going to another. This major thing is going to happen now. There were some major things that happened here, and all of them were just as compelling as the other. They told wonderful stories. I was on the edge of my seat reading this thing. Couldn't stop reading it. And especially as we got towards the end, it did some really special things that I can't really talk about here. I can say a little bit of it without ruining much, but you know, this book at its core, I think, is about an alien war going on kind of in the background, but it comes to the foreground, and I suspect that it will very much go that direction going forward as well. And in most stories that have this alien war type of thing, you know, let's think like an Ender's Game. And certainly Ender's Game is not the only one that does this, but I'll use a very popular example where you will have these demonic type aliens, and at the end you realize that they're not so bad. And what have we done? And they get humanized later on. This book does it kind of the other way around, in that they humanize them out the gate. And then as you go forward, you start to see the trauma of war being involved. And you already sympathize with these people, but it almost makes the horrors of what will eventually be happening in the series that much more impactful because of the way that it got structured here. And I very much thoroughly enjoyed it. The characters themselves are wonderful. The story is told all through the eyes of one person. And while that one person does have tremendous character growth, and you already know that the growth is going to happen because we've already seen what this character turns into. But even in this book, there was a lot of growth that occurred. And the characters around him, you got to see the same. The characters feel unique. They feel fresh. You can picture them so vividly. It's very well done. And it doesn't overstay its welcome in terms of, it doesn't do this Robert Jordan thing where, to give you some picture in your mind about what's happening here and what these characters look like, let me spend 5 pages setting the scene. Ruocchio can do it in a very simple way that conveys things very eloquently and clearly and concisely. It's extremely well done. The side characters are very well done as well. I mean, everything is just done well. It's very intelligent writing, but it doesn't feel like it goes over your head. It does it in a very beautiful way. There's some authors that almost feel like they try too hard. And it's almost like they're looking up words in a thesaurus to try to complicate things that don't naturally flow. Yeah, you just don't get that here. You get everything right. I oftentimes talk about magic in this review. You're not going to find that here. This is very much sci-fi, but instead I'll talk about the technology. And the technology doesn't do anything differently. It's very similar to a lot of things that you've read in the past, but there are some things, especially involving the plot device that's used, I will loosely say, to tie the end of the first act into the beginning of the second act, which was beautifully done. If you don't know what I'm talking about, even if you read this book, come talk to me on Discord. I'll spoiler away. We'll talk about it. But it was very well done. I thought the technology was extremely well done here. What else is there to say? I don't think much. I'm just over the moon by how wonderful this book was. It's tremendous. I cannot recommend this book enough. If you are any sort of fan of sci-fi, you've probably already read this, but drop what you're doing and go read this. If you're any sort of fan of epic fantasy, go read this book. With no caveats. It's not like, yeah, you might not like it if X. Who wouldn't like this book? I don't know who they are. I can't sympathize with that perspective. Oftentimes I can. I certainly can't do it here. So I'm going to wrap things up there. Thank you so much for sticking with this review till the end, the 6 of you that have made it this far. And as always, happy reading to you. Want to give a special shout out to my Ascendant tier patrons, Anna, Ben, CJ, Danute, Darren, Jamie, Maria, Michael Sugarman, My Book is Lit, Romeo Mike, Ron Reich, Russell, and Sky.